My name is Chengjie, and I'm here to present our enterprise risk management analysis for Suncor Energy along with my colleagues Yilin, Lichen, Shuyan, and Jiting. We'll firstly go through the basic company information of Suncor, and then identify Suncor's top 4 core risks. We'll then conduct driver and sub-driver analysis for each risk and propose some potential mitigations. And lastly, we'll conclude the presentation and take any questions in the upcoming Q&A section. Now, I'll yield the floor to Shuyan, who will give us an introduction of the company.
All right, so here is Suncor, a Canadian local energy company based in Calgary. They have one of the largest petroleum resource basins in the world, and their business covers the entire distributional channel around energy. The core value of Suncor is to produce trusted energy that enhances people's life while caring for each other and the earth. They emphasize the importance of safety, discipline, learning, and collaboration. Since their business expands to other countries around the world, Suncor does have certain constraints both internally and externally. For example, they have limitation of production and capacity, and they have heavily affected by exchange rate and government regulation. Plus, due to COVID-19, recent financial situation is not optimistic for them. Their demand, price, sales were affected. However, since Suncor is strong and irreplaceable, they do have bargaining power in the industry. We will evaluate and analyze their KPI from both operational and financial perspective. During pandemic, Suncor's petroleum products and crude oil has a decreasing demand since global capital market and the availability of liquidity has been affected by COVID-19. Moreover, because their business are located at various locations around Canada, Suncor's employees are facing different levels of danger. The stay-at-home order limiting business operation, which forced them to refine their utilization rates. Luckily, Canadian government held the carbon tax flat, which helped them to reduce some cost. So let's move on to the risk part. Currently, Suncor's risks are surrounded by the influence of COVID-19. However, from previous experience, we conclude that government regulatory policy and the competition risk are the major strategic risks for Suncor. Carbon and climate risk, as well as safety risk, cause a big hazard risk for them. Within their company, market accessibility and equipment failure are the biggest operational risk. And the last, since Suncor heavily rely on trading business, the volatility of commodity price and exchange rate are the financial risk for us. Now, my colleague Lichen will tell you more about our first risk, the financial risk.
The top risk in the financial section is the exchange rate. According to Suncor's annual report, 65% of its debt is in US dollar and converted to Suncor's report currency, which is Canadian dollar. Changes in the exchange rates change the total Canadian dollars required to settle Suncor's US debts. Moreover, most of Suncor's revenue are from the sale of oil and natural gas commodities. Their prices are based on the US dollar benchmark prices. For example, in Suncor's 2020 annual report, it states that its sweet SCO price is based on the price of WTI in Cushing, Omaha. One driver of this risk is inflation. Lower inflation leads to higher purchasing power compared to other economics, and as a result, increased exchange rate. Higher inflation is usually accompanied by higher interest rates and usually causes a depreciation of local currency. The second driver of this risk is government policy. Global events such as COVID-19 can affect exchange rates. Many countries' exchange rates weakened when they are initially affected or experiencing the third or second waves of COVID-19. Their exchange rates recovers gradually as the pandemic goes under control. Secondly, a country with government debts is less likely to acquire foreign capital. Foreign investors will sell their bonds in the open market if the market predicts government debt within a certain country. As a result, a decrease in the value of its exchange rates will follow. A country's term of trade improves if its export prices rise at a greater rate than its import prices. The result in higher revenue, which causes a higher demand for the country's currency and an increase in its currency value. And finally, an appreciation of the exchange rate. We have developed 3 plans for Suncor to reduce the severity of this risk. Firstly, Suncor should prepare special funds that are only used to buy foreign currencies when the exchange rate is desirable. For example, when US was hit by the pandemic, Suncor could purchase some US dollars because its exchange rate is likely to be low. The second plan is to provide incentives to encourage customers to sign purchase agreements early and collect receivables in different time periods. The reason is that the exchange rate usually fluctuates within a range. Divide receivables into several parts means even if one payment is made under an undesirable exchange rate, it won't affect the total payment much. Last but not least, Suncor should gradually decrease the percentage of debt in US dollar. Suncor can issue debts in several different currencies to diversify this risk. I will now pass the time to Chengjie to talk about the operational risk.
Thank you, Lichen. So another one of the top 4 risks that Suncor is facing right now is the equipment failure risk. Many of Suncor's oil drilling and refinery projects involve the cooperation of interdependent component systems. The failure of any one equipment in one of these systems could directly affect other systems and potentially cause a loss of production or a full shutdown. Therefore, it is Suncor's top priority to minimize the risk of equipment failure before it causes a large adverse effect on Suncor's business and financial conditions. The first driver of the equipment failure is an inappropriate maintenance of the equipment. Equipment that is not periodically maintained could be more vulnerable to rust, erosion, and wear downs, which could eventually build up to a full breakdown. The first subdriver of the risk is insufficient maintenance policies. It occurs when there is a poor scheduling or when it is not being carefully executed. Another subdriver that Suncor is currently facing is the shortage of qualified engineers to conduct the maintenance due to the pandemic. In addition, since Suncor's oil and natural gas projects are outdoors, they can be affected by natural disasters or extreme weathers, such as extreme heat or cold, flooding, drought, or unanticipated erosion and corrosion. Such risk is often inherent in the geographic characteristic of each site. For example, it is more likely to encounter extreme cold rather than heat in Suncor's oil sand site in Alberta. The second subdriver is the lack of disaster response measures. Without a proper plan to prepare, respond, and recover from a natural disaster or extreme weather, Suncor could be more vulnerable to these incidents and suffer a larger loss. Suncor could improve its equipment maintenance by assembling a maintenance team that reviews its maintenance policy and makes sure it's effective and adequate. The maintenance team could also host training sessions to ensure the compliance of each maintenance, and introduce job rotations, train more employees for maintenance, and to mitigate the potential supply shortage of qualified laborers. On the other side, Suncor could leverage the knowledge of local professionals to research potential natural disasters and extreme weathers at each site and develop disaster response policy to mitigate against such occurrence. Lastly, it could also purchase climate insurances to hedge this risk. And I will now yield the floor to Yilin, who will identify Suncor's next top risk.
In terms of strategic risk, the top risk that Suncor faces is the regulatory risk. By the Carnegie's Oil Climate Index shown in the figure above, Canada's Athabasca oil sands, in which multiple projects of Suncor operate in, is one of the world's most carbon-intensive oil sands with the highest GHG emissions. Therefore, we can see that Suncor is currently operating with high carbon emission across its primary business segments. This in turn poses Suncor to risks regarding regulations, since governments in Canada and around the world are enacting additional and more stringent carbon laws applicable to companies in the energy industry in general and in the oil sands industry in particular. These existing and future laws and regulations would negatively impact Suncor by lowering the demand for petroleum and increasing the company's costs, imposing significant constraints on Suncor's development. There are two main drivers to this risk: climate change and energy innovation. First, climate change or global warming is the main reason why more and more stringent regulations and laws are enacted in the energy industry. As climate change is in root caused by the heavy use of fossil fuels and the burn-off from oil drilling industry, governments are adopting ambitious emission reduction targets and supporting legislation in the oil sand industry, which add on more taxes, levies, and capital expenditure to Suncor's current costs. Secondly, with energy innovation, additional government laws in favor of renewable energy are enacted to encourage the development of clean energy products such as electric cars, making more and more companies shifting to using more clean and renewable energy. These changes largely lowers the competency of companies in the traditional energy industry such as Suncor. Plus, with increased public opposition to fossil fuels, the demand for petroleum is very likely to decrease, having a negative impact on Suncor's sales and growth. In order to treat this risk, first, Suncor should expand the products and pursue growth in other low-carbon energy products such as power and biofuels in order to reduce the negative impact of the carbon regulations while embrace the opportunities brought along with the laws. Second, Suncor should adopt and develop new technologies in order to reduce carbon emission. They can use and implement low-carbon technologies such as carbon capture utilization and sequestration. Next, I will hand over to Jiting to talk about hazard risk.
Thanks, Yilin. Next, I'm going to introduce one of the most important hazard risks faced by Suncor, carbon risk, which can be categorized into physical carbon risk and decarbonization. Physical carbon risk refers to the extreme weather events caused by climate-related issues, which could damage assets and cause worker injuries. Survey shows that climate volatility impacts nearly 9 in 10 organizations. Those risks generally have a severe impact on organizations. There are some drivers that make the carbon risk important to Suncor. First of all, there are insufficient and inadequate plans to adapt to climate change, such as modifying physical assets or processes for future climate scenarios. Why is that the case? Well, firstly, executives are overconfident in their ability to mitigate risks. Nearly 90% of executives think they have a good understanding of the financial risks caused by the climate change. However, over half of them haven't integrated climate into their financial risk management, which is exactly the case in Suncor. Secondly, Suncor focuses on decarbonization over physical climate risks. Its current climate strategies are heavily focused on net zero and ESG goals. Hence, very limited resources are allocated to deal with physical carbon risks. Another driver is the volatility in climate change. Although historical data are available, without thorough and insightful analysis, Suncor cannot utilize those unpredictable and fluctuated data. Finally, the scope of the impact from climate change is wide. Companies from various industries can potentially be influenced, which also includes Suncor and its material suppliers. As one of the principal risks, carbon risk is closely connected with other types of risks, which may impact Suncor's ability to meet its objectives and preserve its mission vision and its core values. Without a comprehensive plan to mitigate and transfer this risk, Suncor's future growth will be largely limited. Therefore, I recommend Suncor to understand how to adapt to climate change and build resilience into their strategies. To understand and identify the most relevant risks, the Environmental Health, Safety and Sustainable Development Committee in Suncor should build up in-house skills and knowledge with the help of the expert and the third party, because the climate data is complex to interpret and utilize. Next, in order to mitigate those risks, the committee needs to apply climate-specific business intelligence and integrate actionable insight into their strategies. And appropriate insurance is a good tool to transfer the pure losses from the risks. Finally, the ELT and the CSO should together make sure that those plans integrate well with other strategies and implement successfully in order to build resilience. Next, Chengjie will take this presentation home.
Thank you, Jiting. So in conclusion, after conducting a comprehensive risk analysis for Suncor, we have identified Suncor's top 4 long-term risks, as well as Suncor's short-term challenges due to the pandemic. For each risk, we have identified their drivers and the underlying sub-drivers, and developed the potential mitigations for each driver. For more details on each of the 4 risks, as well as how we ranked and selected these 4 as Suncor's top risks, please feel free to address your questions in the upcoming Q&A session. Thank you for watching, and we hope to talk to you soon.